Turn on, tune in, wig out.
Get ready to rock radio.
At that time then, in the late 60s, and we're going to revisit your black and white past really, Martin, with a track from the 1960s as we go along here. But going back to that period, I mean, you were playing in an essentially blues rock-based style, and how did you find your guitar style developed within Jethro Tull? Because you developed it with albums like, for instance, Benefit and then the classic Aqualung. But was this a natural progression at the time? It became less bluesy, perhaps a bit more what we might call, mainstream rock, but you've always been a trailblazer for progressive rock guitar. I mean, was this a natural progression for you, really? Or were you responding to, the members in the band, the time, the musical times, that type of thing?
Well, I never had an agenda musically, and in the blues boom, where everybody was sitting down learning Albert King, Freddie King, and B.B. King licks, I never wanted to do it because I just thought all these people were sort of a cheap imitation, and it was all rather pointless. So, and I didn't like the blues that much either. I did a little bit. So I just had my own style, but the things I listened to were quite diverse. R&B, soul, classical, rock, everything and anything. But I didn't focus on any one style of music. And as a band, I think we're pretty well all the same. We're fairly naive musically, as I think all bands in the late 60s were, whether they admitted it or not. So we're just bunch of young kids learning how to play and learning how to develop our musicality, techniques, just becoming musicians. And we were learning this all in parallel, so that the 4 or 5 members of Jethro Tull we were writing bits of music, Ian was writing songs, we were sitting down arranging them and recording them, and all the time developing as musicians. And so obviously we all sort of went in the same direction as a band, but we were just sort of feeling our way, and so there wasn't an agenda like this year we're going to play a more bluesy album, but then the next one's going to be a bit more rock and roll. It just sort of went wherever it was going to take us.
Really a reflection of the sum of the band's parts, I suppose. It wasn't just one person, perhaps, although Ian Anderson's been a leading light since that period. And I think at the time you were moving away. I think that was one of the reasons perhaps you were recruited, was that Ian wanted to go in a less bluesy direction, let's say. Yeah,
he did. I mean, I wasn't aware of it, but that was part of the reason. Although when the guitar players were auditioned for Jethro Tull for Mick Abraham's job, there were a lot of blues guitar players that Ian considered. So I think whatever happened, he would have written that music. But it suited me that I didn't have to look at the music and play it in a style that I already had. And so I just sort of, with every piece of music, we looked from fresh. And it's been that way from over the 43 years, however long it is, of Jethro Tull. Every time we do an album, or we're sitting down arranging and learning music, it's just a blank canvas, which is I hate the expression, but it is the one that fits, because we just sort of very broad-minded.
You mentioned there the auditions for Jethro Tull. I know there's the legendary story, and perhaps you don't mind recounting it here, Martin, of how you were recruited by Ian Anderson. I believe it was maybe a London hotel. You didn't have an amplifier, or maybe you didn't have an amplifier lead, and you were leaning up against, he was leaning up against your guitar to try and hear it. Can you enlighten us?
Well, it's part of the story. It's a very complex and long story of how I joined Jethro Tull, and I'll try and briefly do it from beginning to end. But I was in a blues band called Gethsemane. I played flute. I played it in the Roland Kirk style, and so I knew about Ian and Jethro Tull, and he knew about me. And we did a gig in Plymouth where we finally met and got on really well, chatting away. And then the next thing I know, they're looking for a guitar player, and they remembered me, but they didn't know how to find me. Eventually, they traced me to this gig in London, which was we were about to split the band up anyway. So I auditioned, and the first time I didn't get the gig, Tony Iommi was offered it. Then that didn't quite work out, so we did another day audition, just me, and then I didn't actually get the job, but they sort of said, okay, let's carry on from there. And the next thing, Ian said, come round to my flat and bring a guitar. Now, he lived on the 5th floor of a sort of very skanky block of flats in North London, and so trekking up those stairs with an amplifier didn't sort of come to mind. So I just took my electric guitar, and that's why. And we just sat in this room. I think we were learning Nothing Is Easy, but of course you couldn't hear anything anybody was doing because there was no amps in there. That's how that story came about.
And then from there, you got the job, presumably. Did he tell you on the spot?
No, they never said anything for weeks. There was never a word said. I think they were. It was very weird. In fact, they didn't talk to me very much, and I think in the back of their minds that they were so used to having Mick Abrams around, they probably weren't that 100% sure about me. In fact, I know they weren't. And it was a difficult period because we were doing gigs in England where the last time they'd seen the band, it was a blues band, and then suddenly he was Jethro Tull again, but he wasn't a blues guitar player, and they were doing these weird songs which eventually would become stand-up, and a lot of them didn't like it. They sort of going, what's going on? What happened to the old blues band that we loved? So it was difficult for everybody, and there was just a sort of a period where we had to make sure that they were accepting what we were doing, and they did. And then it sort of moved on into a more formal area of, yes, now maybe you are part of Jethro Tull. I think they left their options open for quite a long time.
I mean, was there any period in the band's history, from the 70s through to the end of the 90s, when you might have called it a bit more tricky in terms of the band's development? We've already mentioned that early 90s, maybe even slightly before that, Ian Anderson was finding it more difficult with his vocals. So I suppose you could say from a sort of band point of view, things were a bit more difficult as you went forward. But in terms of the music business, has there been any time really, Martin, over that period that you've not struggled, but you'd say it was perhaps a dip in the band's fortunes?
Well, I don't really think so, because the touring never diminished. It always stayed the same intensity, the same venues. I mean, certainly into the 90s, beginning of 2000s. But I think musically, there were a couple of blips. Passion Play wasn't received as well as I think he deserved to be, and people, you go in and out of favour. One day everybody loves you, the next day it's fashionable to hate you. But these are just sort of blips, and really the majority of the fan base just kept on going through all these ups and downs. But I mean, maybe because there were trends, and the trends were away from bands like us, the sort of prog touring bands did get a lot of stick in a couple of occasions, and I know we had the record label was sort of pressuring us to come up with a big album again, and they said, no, you've got to have a producer, and they sort of said, Fleetwood Mac have used this guy and had a monster album, and then Chicago, or they had all these albums with who had big production things going on, and they wanted us to use a major producer, and it was a disaster, an absolute disaster. We didn't want it, but they insisted, and the album that came out, it was Broadsword, which I thought was always a very uncomfortable album. You know, it sort of didn't have a focus or a direction, and it was murder to make it. We went through so many studios and producers, and in the end, all we wanted was somebody who was nice, who sat in the control room and said, "Okay, guys, we're going to have a cup of tea now. Hey, let's stop for lunch." You know, I like that. They didn't say much. They didn't have much input at all. But the ones who felt an obligation to input musically and artistically, just forget it. It didn't work with Jethro Tull, because we've always known what we want to do and how to do it, because we've done it more than anybody. Our experience is far greater than any A&R person or production guru.
There's a sort of an irony here, because you grew up, as far as the band was concerned, in times of great budgets, you know, record label, but that leads to pressure, like you say, for albums. And then more recently, bands have been able to wrestle back the control, haven't they, really? And probably for the last decade, Jethro Tull have very much done your own thing as you wanted to do, really, without that interference, you know.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it changed. I think that people didn't want to spend huge amounts of money on bringing a producer. I think they just recognised that bands were able to learn. Part of their trade was arranging and production. I mean, it is. Everybody, it's the whole deal of being a musician encompasses much more than actually playing an instrument. You have to know about recording, you have to know about songwriting, about arranging other instruments. And it's really a lot of fun to do as well. You don't want to give any of that away to somebody else, because it's a part of the whole experience of being a musician.
Yeah, and we should say also that Tull really bucked the trends. I mean, you kept abreast of musical trends, and late 80s, of course, you received that award for the best hard rock heavy metal performance for Crest of a Knave, which was maybe a surprise to a lot of people, but nevertheless it showed that you were still relevant. Yeah,
well, it was just an unfortunate category in my mind. You know, we've never been a heavy metal band and never will, but you know, we sort of hard rock occasionally, and I just think that they didn't really think too hard about the name of the category, so it brought about a slight disruption in the fans of other bands. But really, the fact was that the people in the industry thought we deserved recognition and acknowledgement of that, and that was the Grammy, and I think we deserved it. Excuse me being a bit pompous, but I feel really good about it. Nobody can ever take it away, and I think, yeah, you know, it was a good album, and we put a lot into the music industry, so we deserve a little nod, a little pat on the back now and again.
This is radio for the internet age. Get ready to rock radio.